This is Mara and Ben for StellarStrategyGaming. A while back I had posted in one of the D&D forums I follow what would people like to see in a D&D video, and someone mentioned the subject of table etiquette. So that is what we are going to be discussing today.
Yes, now, don't mistake us in what we mean by table etiquette. We're not here to discuss rules lawyering. We're not here to discuss those kinds of people who don't necessarily agree with whatever the campaign setting is, usually. We're mainly here to discuss what is appropriate and what is not appropriate to do in order for everyone to have the most fun while they are at the table playing the game.
And we're going to start with the absolute basics, which somehow a lot of people seem to miss. Show up on time. Be ready to play on time, whether that's an online game or an in-person game. And when I say show up and be ready, I don't just mean be present as in logged in or at the table. I once played with someone who, I guess his sister was joining the campaign, and they did not have a character made up for her at the time she came to the table. So it was something where it was really frustrating because this was a magic user she was going to be playing. So not only were they doing stats and so forth, they were also putting together a spell list. And I actually said, you wait till now to do all of this. Similarly, if you're playing in an online platform, make sure your web connection is good. Make sure whoever is in the house with you knows not to interrupt you whilst you're playing. Pro tip, if you have a little kid in the house, someone's going to interrupt you whilst you're playing. And anybody else. If you're fighting with your significant other and they're going to walk in the middle of it, then it's time to bow out of the session. Also, be aware of the environment you're creating for people. If you're a smoker, people are going to smell it on you. Mara and I have had the experience of playing with someone who reeked of tobacco to the point that it was a real disruption to the rest of the table. And similarly, if you're playing online, watch your background noise. If you're going to be eating potato chips, turn your mic off while you're doing that. All of that kind of stuff.
Oh, yes, and to those who are wondering, the campaign setting just changed or whatever it is, so they don't have a character prepared, because that one is a reasonable excuse, I'd say, is we've had campaigns change on us at the last minute. We actually brought it up in our last video, I believe. What I do is I have on my phone a generic fighter character sheet, which I pull out every time I'm not ready to go with a character. I don't necessarily like playing this character, but they're there for those awkward situations where you need to play and you don't necessarily want to spend an hour and a half creating your custom backstory or whatever it is. And so I'd highly recommend for those situations especially, just keep an extra character on hand. It's not that hard, and you can always just reflavor them throughout the campaign.
Yes, and additionally, if you have questions about the character you're bringing to the table, would it be better for me to be a thief rogue or an assassin rogue? That's fine. There's always a chance to make that. Would it be ready for me to take this spell or that spell? All of that is fine. Just have at least the general outlines of what you're going to do, so you're not sitting there with the rest of the table sitting around waiting for you to figure out your character.
Yes, and also just be sure, I do feel this falls into table etiquette, be sure that if you're going to say you're playing something, you actually play that thing, If you're in an established long-term campaign and you say, I'm going to play a stealthy guy who's all into those politics and all of that, and then suddenly you start playing a romancer bard, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the romancer bard, but it disrupts everyone else when they were expecting a super serious political character. I've had it happen more than once where that was the case. Or this one was not on my friend here, but a friend I'm going to call Dave, he wanted to make an ice mage and brought that to the table. And in all fairness, in D&D there aren't a lot of ice spells. Basically fire is the way to go. So he switched it to fire, which is great and all, except that I had spent the entire campaign, my time tailoring the campaign a bit around his ice mage, so this random introduction of a new damage type did kind of throw plans off. And while it is the job of a DM to sort of roll with the punches, it also affected how his character worked with the other players, because fire is much more dangerous than ice usually. So, again, just cannot overstate this enough. Play what you say you're going to play.
Yes, and also respect that not everybody's playstyle is going to be exactly the same as yours. For example, sometimes DM will say, okay, you do enough damage to kill this creature, how do you kill it? Well, somebody might just say, I stab it. And don't get me wrong, I really do like people describing this great cinematic kill, but if the player's not into that, if they just want to roll their damage and say, yeah, I stab it, or yeah, I cut its head off, and that's it, you have to go with that. And it cuts the other way, too. Taking 20 had a really great video about different ways to start a campaign, because normally what do? Everybody introduces their character, and we all sit around and we half pay attention while everybody tells us about their dwarf who became a mage, blah, 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 no one cares. And so I decided one time to, as a one-shot, I decided to just go straight into it. You're at the tavern. There's this person talking about something. Here's what's going on. Some of the players went along with it just fine. A couple of players basically half paid attention, and one of them actually said, are we going to introduce our characters? And it was the kind of thing where if after the fact somebody had said, let's not start out that way going forward, totally would have respected it. But in the moment, when you're, as the DM, you're trying to set up the scene, and you're trying to do something a little creative and do something a little different, that really takes the wind out of your sails. And you've got to respect that kind of throughout in terms of how people tell the story, how people relate events.
Yeah, well, and that can come down to even just the finest of details. Going back to a topic I always love covering here, which is Matt Mercer's campaigns. And he introduces it by describing this complex scene and not even necessarily having the main characters in that moment, but then he'll introduce them. And as mentioned here, Ben did do that one campaign where he just sort of skipped the introductions altogether. And for an Innistrad campaign that I was running for Ben, I didn't really have him introduce his character beforehand. I introduced the world before the character. So doing things a little out of order is not really possible in D&D because there is no established order, and that's kind of the point of the game. So before we get into some of the heavier stuff, just everyone should always remember this game is not about rules. It's about the opposite. It is about what players and DMs do to expand upon and look outside of the box. And so shooting someone down for doing that really should never be tolerated, I'd say. If someone says, no, you can't play your halfling fighter or whatever it is, if someone says, no, you can't do whatever action it is because it's not specifically covered in the books, that, I would say, is an example of both rules lawyering and also a violation of table etiquette because it defeats the spirit of the game.
And speaking of the spirit of the game, one thing that's really important is know whose turn it is to talk, and only that person is talking. Generally speaking, if the DM is talking, it's important that no one else is. Also, if you are on someone's turn, or if someone has started to relate an action that they are doing, it's very important that you let the person finish what they are saying. A common example of where this goes wrong is the person whose turn it was last goes, oh wait, I forgot such tough. You forgot the other person's doing their thing. You're breaking up the flow of the game. You're breaking up the immersion. Just let it ride. Your turn is over. I've also had the experience, though, of having the DM break that rule where either I was narrating something from a flavor perspective and the DM interrupted it to essentially rules lawyer. Not really rules lawyer, just sort of, well, you didn't really take his head off. You reached his maximum health. Like, who cares? It's combat. It's a game. Don't steal the fun of it unless it makes some kind of actual difference, which it usually does not when someone is describing their cinematic kill. I also had a setup one time with a warlock I was playing where we were in a hallway. One of my allies was in front of me, and I wanted to Eldritch Blast. My warlock was a high enough level to do 2 Eldritch Blast beams, and basically what I was going to say is I want to Eldritch Blast, and I want to put one hand on each of my allies' shoulders and basically finger guns this Eldritch Blast. Now, if the DM had said you can't do that, I would have accepted it. Of course, that is within the rules, that is within the rights of the DM. to say you cannot do something like that. What the DM did, though, was interrupted me mid-sentence, which was actually much more frustrating because there again, you're breaking up the flow of what the person is trying to articulate, you're breaking up their creativity, and also to that similar point, in the interest of creating that flow, it's extremely important that you know what you're going to do on your turn. I want to be clear. If you have a question, that's fine, but have some idea. Don't let it get to be your turn and then it's, oh, let me look at my spell list.
Yes, and I actually have a story sort of to compare of a DM specifically allowing someone to do something which wasn't necessarily inside the rules, which is at one point in time I played an Azamar character, and we were fighting a fire-based monster. And so my solution to this problem was I cast two spells. I cast the Meld with Stone spell, which allows you to just sort of become one with the stone as long as you exited it on your turn, and I cast an enhanced fly spell so that I could fly a bit higher, and I carried the fire-based creature up high enough that it froze to death, which isn't in the rules, but I still let it happen because fall damage would still have killed it, so it sort of was the same thing. And then on top of that, when I fell, I hit a stone building and the entire thing exploded because that looks awesome. And to quote Runesmith, if it's awesome, just goddamn do it, you know? That is the first rule of D&D. None of the rules which I used there are actually in the book, but it was just so cool that everyone allowed it, you know? And when you get in the way of not only interrupting someone when they're doing something cool, but when you also actively go out of your way to kill things which are cool within your game, it honestly just makes your campaign, your story, whatever it is, it makes it feel dull. Like, it's not really a fantasy game at that point if you don't allow fantastical events to happen.
Yes. Now, it's very important for the sake of immersion and the comfort of the players that you do set up certain boundaries, preferably ahead of time. For example, some people like to have intimacy in their campaigns. Some people like to have intimacy between player characters as part of the games. Best off to discuss it ahead of time before you get into this at the risk of making someone uncomfortable. And definitely, if somebody says, you know, my character is going to make a charisma check to this character to try to seduce them, especially if it's another player character, the DM is well within rights to say, are you allowing this to happen? And I would actually say that's the case with any player versus player interaction, whether it's trying to steal something from another player, whether it's attacking another player. We have a friend named Vic who we've sometimes criticized their playstyle and actions on this channel, but one thing Vic did when they were DMing one time that I greatly appreciated was my character had touched a cursed artifact that was causing their arm to turn to stone, and one of the other players said, I'm going to cut that arm off. Vic turned to me before allowing an attack roll or anything else and said, are you okay with this? Are you okay with this happening? And I was. It was fine. I just really appreciated them giving me that opportunity. I've heard many, many stories, particularly from people who present as female, of mostly players who present as male, doing things in-game that are just creepy and uncomfortable. So ideally you establish those kinds of boundaries ahead of time. If you haven't, then you respect them in-game. And I'm sorry, DMs, that is part of your job, is when things like that start to get happening, make sure everybody's happy, make sure everybody's comfortable with what's going on.
Yes, and with that mention of the DM, I feel that this is also perhaps a little outside of what we had planned, but I do feel as though we need a segment to specifically focus on what the DM is supposed to do, because I've heard stories of DMs who, for example, killed roleplay because they wanted to get to the dice throwing, or vice versa. You know, it's important for a DM to know they are not a player. You know, they do not get to choose the play style of the campaign as much as they build the world. When they agree to become the DM, while they still are entitled to a certain amount of fun, they have to remember that they have taken on the primary role of facilitating others' fun. So if your players are too busy talking about what they want to do in the tent city, perhaps don't have guards swarm them, as we've discussed on this channel in past campaigns. And also, if your players are busy in the middle of an important fight scene, don't interrupt it with a cutscene. Just don't do it. That is something which so many DMs have forgotten, and it kills campaigns.
As a DM, you are a storyteller, but you are not writing a novel. You do not necessarily know where the story goes, and you don't necessarily know how the story ends. Sometimes players do weird things. Sometimes players find solutions to your problems that you didn't think of. If you can't allow for this to happen, you are not DMing right. Part of the fun of the game is the creativity of it. And then honestly, one thing I'll sometimes do as a DM is if the players are clearly beating the big bad, but it's going to take them 10 turns to do enough damage just by rolling dice over and over again, I'm going to cut the combat short. I'm going to say you got it, because there's just no point. You got to. There again, rule of cool. Is this fun? Is this exciting? Is this making the game go forward? Now, there are certain behaviors you can restrict or eliminate in the game, especially if they make the game unfun for other players. A good example of that is the murder hobo phenomenon. You can, if a player is uncomfortable with the other player's murder hoboing, that's a good time to stop and say, look, some of you seem to want to fight, some of you seem to want to interact with the townsfolk rather than murdering and looting them. What are we doing here? What is this campaign going to be like? And it's not necessarily on you to reach the conclusion, but it's on you to start the conversation because you are in charge of the table.
Yes, and this is also, that personally ties into some experiences I have had, where even though everyone enjoys a good killing spree in D&D, admittedly, that is part of the fun of the game, is the combat. I have an aversion to blood, a fairly strong one. And while that does not usually come up in a game, there have been players who I've been playing with who take advantage of the aforementioned how do you kill the monster to say that they do a Final Fantasy fatality move where they rip out the heart and such, but with a lot more graphic detail than anyone asked for. And to go back to my earlier statement, it's DM's job not to stop something awesome, but if that same thing that looks awesome is actually going to hurt or in any way negatively affect another player within the valid reasons for that player not liking it, you need to say, look, dude, you're provoking this person's phobia, you're making them uncomfortable, whatever it is, and sort of harkens back to Ben's point, where it is like the killing especially, because with the killing and with other NSFW things in D&D, those are the things which you have to keep the closest eye on as a DM. You do not have the luxury of saying, oh, it's just D&D, I'll glide off the rules for those, because those are controlled solely by your players, not by the rules. And you always have to remember that.
Yes. Now, we're going to move on to sort of some of the class expectations. Not everybody has to play a class a specific way, but if you're playing a class that has the ability to take the spell Healing Word, take the spell Healing Word. It's something that helps the table so much. And it's really important to have an understanding of a role within the party. Now, we were in a game a while back where there was a player who was playing a bard, and basically this bard... I want to be fair to this person. They didn't sign up to be the party's healer. They weren't playing a cleric. They wanted to do spells and shoot arrows, and they wanted to do bard stuff. But there was a point where Mara was playing a cleric, and Mara was down, and this bard did not take the opportunity to cast Healing Word and bring the cleric back up, which, ironically enough, actually put more pressure on the bard to be the party's healer. This is the kind of thing where I'm talking about when you talk about stuff out of game. You need to have those kinds of conversations. I don't always want to be the tank. I don't want to be the party's healer. You know, and in that situation, the way I dealt with that was I was playing a monk, so I took a few levels in cleric just so that there was a backup healer in the campaign, and it worked out fine. But it was the kind of thing where in the moment, because we hadn't had the conversation ahead of time, it was a bad situation for that session.
Yes, and well, this one will be going on a little longer just because of these great stories. That cleric character of mine went down not just in a normal fight, but in a fight with an undead. And if you know anything about clerics, about 95% of their abilities revolve around killing undead extra good. So, not only is it a problem when someone else plays a bit too far outside of what's expected of them, because while playing a bard in the spellcasting kind of way is fun, they do have multiple healing spells in their arsenal. They clearly are meant to be the class that gets the healing spell if no one took cleric. You know, that is part of the obligation. But also, if you not following a class obligation actually makes it harder for the person who did take a character to specifically follow those obligations, it can really come off as just kind of jerky, because I took that healing class because I was told that there were no other healers. So just consider that. If someone else has sacrificed what they consider to be a good, different character to fulfill what the party needed at that moment, and you go out of your way to not facilitate that, you can really offend a member of your party.
Absolutely, and this goes for many others as well. If your tank doesn't protect the spellcasters, then why do you have a tank? If your rogue isn't sneaking around doing sneak attack damage, what's the rogue good for at that point? We've mentioned before on this channel the case we had of a player who wanted to play a pacifist character but who was actively interrupting and stopping combat. You have to play with consideration for the other. You're part of a team. You have to play with consideration for the other players, for what they're trying to do, and you have to play with some consideration for the DM and their world. The murder hoboing thing, not only is it annoying to players who are trying to play the game with some seriousness, it's also really frustrating as a DM when you research a fantasy world or build a fantasy world or whatever it is you need to do, and the player's attitude about everything is, I want to kill it. So have some respect for the other people in the game, have some respect for the game, and if your take on it is, I really would like to have a session where we just stab everything we meet right in the face, that's fine. But have the discussion. Don't just derail a campaign or even a session over it without giving everybody some warning for it. I hope you've enjoyed this one. We always enjoy making these videos. The channel is growing slowly. We really appreciate all the views we've been getting. If you could take a moment to like the video, or if you're enjoying the content, even subscribe. That actually really helps us out. It helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for listening. Mara, what are your final thoughts?
My final thoughts are that, again, thank you for all the support, but also the next thing that we will be discussing is the problem with your BBEG, or Big Bad Evil Guy. And we also hope that to start seeing some perhaps suggestions for videos in the future, because we definitely want some more feedback from the community. And yeah, we hope you enjoyed this video.